Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Farm Science Review. I'm here with Jason Hartschuh, and today we are going to have an interview where we talk about vomitoxin and vomitoxin management. So Jason, to start us off, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and what you do for Ohio State University.
All right, thanks, Wade. Yeah, I am an extension field specialist at The Ohio State University in dairy management, precision livestock, and within that I also work in feed quality, which is what really got me into this vomitoxin management side. My background, I've been with Ohio State since 2012, grew up on a family dairy farm in Crawford County, started out at Ohio State in Crawford County where we have a large swine integrator. So between the dairy farm and that swine background, it kind of got me going on the vomitoxin work really while I was in the county. And then moved into the state field specialist position, and now I do research around vomitoxin and feed quality management. So mostly on the corn side, vomitoxin, corn silage, corn grain vomitoxin, and then some silage work, and then also work in precision livestock. So those technologies that are coming into the livestock industry, whether that's sensor-based technology on the animal, or we're starting to do some drone work in southern Ohio of how can we better manage pastures that we maybe shouldn't be driving on with ATVs because they're a little bit on that tippy side because they're so steep down the strip mine ground. So how do we use drones to help keep our farmers safer? So kind of a broad range, but really the vomitoxin work is important across all of Ohio for all of our livestock industry and our export markets.
Well, you've become one of the premier experts on vomitoxin management, but before we get into that, you do travel across the state of Ohio. You see a lot of crops. What are you seeing out there right now? We have a beautiful day at Farm Science Review. There's a lot of guys in the field. So what's the early report sound like?
Yeah, I would say when you look at fields, it's a little bit scary. Things are coming in surprisingly better than expected looking at the crop. But at the same time, we can definitely tell those drought and dry issues are present. There's some crop that we're going to see those 30, 40 bushel yields. But I also think when we look at those same spots historically, if we would have seen this 20, 30 years ago, those would be zero spots. So across all those hybrids that are out there, we're seeing that change in genetics that's maybe allowing us to do a little bit better. And talking with farmers, it's going to be a different year, but I think things are a little better. It's disappointing, but still a little better than when we first looked. Who would expect a 6-foot tall corn plant that would normally be 10 or 11 foot tall to be pushing 200 bushel corn? Now, test weight might still be out there. I think we're going to see a little bit lighter test weights in some spots. That's been some reports, but we've heard anything from about 13% to 22% corn coming off. And who expects that during Farm Science Review?
Well, thanks for that. You have, like I said, become extremely well-versed in vomitoxin management, and your expertise is extremely valuable to Ohio's farmers because of that. Can you tell us what type of weather largely contributes to vomitoxin? And then are there any early indications about what kind of pressure farmers could expect to see this year?
Yeah, definitely. I'd be remiss to not mention Dr. Pierce Ball, our Ohio State corn pathologist and also department chair now. He's done a lot of this work also, and especially a lot of the weather work. Worked closely with his team. We kind of called ourselves, nicknamed it the vomitoxin management team now, as we work together on this to look for solutions for Ohio farmers. And weather's a big deal. And that question of, are we going to see vomitoxin issues this year? What was that weather like? So we've been looking at weather. So the big range is we need weather that's in that temperature range between 59 and 86 degrees and a relative humidity over 80%. For infection to occur and then for that Fusarium granularum fungus to continue to multiply. So when we think about Ohio, during pollination, do we spend a lot of time in that 59 to 86 degrees and nice and humid? We really do. And that's really one of those reasons why this disease, if we look, has a lot of focus around the Great Lakes. Ohio's working on it. Ontario, Canada's working in it. Michigan State, but Michigan State's really focused on the silage side where they've done a lot of their work. Northern Indiana, Wisconsin on the silage side. So there is focus, but it really all falls around the Great Lakes, and Ohio seems to kind of be an epicenter. And that gets even worse when we get a little warmer. So we get above that 70 degrees, over 90% humidity. It multiplies a little bit faster, but it does shut down when we get really hot. So when we're over that 86 degrees, it kind of shuts down and it doesn't multiply. So as we go south, even if they're humid, they're hotter, so they don't have as many challenges. They have other mycotoxins to deal with, but not the Don and the Zearalenose that are caused by that Gibberella ear rot.
Have you heard anything on, as far as early reports go, on vomitoxin so far this year?
Yeah, so we had the weather conditions during pollination across the state, but really what we're seeing, we've heard a couple low numbers maybe in that 1 or 2 parts per million, but no high numbers, no widespread numbers coming in yet on this early corn. And we also know that the disease continues to grow the longer the crop is in the field. And that's why a lot of times we hear that, a full season hybrid is worse than an early season hybrid. It may not be that hybrid is more susceptible. The reality of it may be that it just spends more time in the field because you harvest those early season hybrids sooner, they dry down more, so you don't have as much moisture in under that husk for the disease to continue to multiply. Because some of our work shown that the maturity group isn't that big a factor. There's resistant, susceptible across all maturity groups, but we know the longer it's in the field, the more time it has, which is another thing we're working on in weather conditions. Is if we know we have a susceptible hybrid, those are those ones that maybe we need to get out there and harvest sooner, because then we shut that hybrid and that Fusarium granularum growth down. So yeah, we might have to spend more on dryer gas for that hybrid, but we get it off the field so the Don doesn't continue to multiply and have more of that fungus and more of the toxin. It's one of those interesting diseases. We can have a lot of fungus present when we look at that ear, and it didn't produce a lot of toxin. But we can also look at an ear and think it's clean, and here a small amount of fungus actually produced a decent amount of toxin. So that kind of makes it one of those diseases that's a little bit harder to scout for. You walk in a field and see tar spot, you can easily visually rate that and know what your issue was. But with Gibberella ear rot, Fusarium granularum, and really that deoxynivalenol Don production, you don't know until that grain sample gets tested where you're really at. But this year, with these drier conditions as we've gone into fall, we probably won't have as much growth within those ears that are infected. So it's probably not going to be a year for double digits. Now, that's not saying somebody in Ohio won't have double digits, because we have had regions that have just been lucky and they've gotten that moisture, and maybe they will have those right environmental conditions. But as a broad brush across the state, we haven't had that after pollination moisture, unfortunately, to drive yield, but also that won't keep those kernels and ears damp for fungal growth.
That's a great synopsis. Thank you for that. I know that Ohio State has been working on a predictive weather model to try and anticipate in advance whether or not a year is going to have higher vomitoxin levels than normal. Where do things stand with that, and what can we expect from that moving forward?
Yeah, so we're really excited about that. You may be aware of the wheat head scab model, which has become a great tool for producers to look at wheat head scab, which is actually caused by the same fungus, Fusarium granularum, and make predictions based on hybrid susceptibility as to whether it makes sense to apply a fungicide. And we're going that way on corn also. The model currently is really designed to look at, do we have weather conditions during pollination for a risk of 1 part per million or greater vomitoxin, or 1 part per million or less vomitoxin. And when we look at that model, why do we choose 1 part per million? That's kind of a do we have it or not number. For a lot of portions of industry, it'd be nice if we had a 3 or a 5 part per million number, because that's kind of where their different cutoffs are depending what they're trying to feed. But that gets a little bit more challenging. That 1 part per million is, did we have the right environmental conditions for infection to happen or not? So that's Ohio State's been working on that for about 5 years. This is the first year we really rolled out a prediction model. So this year, in the corn newsletter, every week during the majority of pollination, the last 2 weeks, we kind of fell off. We had a couple conferences and we just didn't get our model ran. But we put out a prediction for across the state utilizing different OSU weather stations. The goal with that is to continue to build the model. So the model works off of hourly weather data. And that's looking at how many hours we spend for the 21 days pre-silking within that temperature and humidity range to predict that chance or risk of having that mycotoxin infection, vomitoxin, the fungus. And then we can predict and put a model out. The ultimate goal of that model is to pull in more weather data. So pull in weather data from airports that have hourly publicly available weather data. Maybe even make it so that farmers can feed in their own weather stations, because we know that Ohio's weather network density really isn't dense enough to be able to catch the variation in summer temperatures and humidity that happen across the state. But we have to make sure it's good data that's coming in. So some airports have better data than others, but pull that in and actually put it together into a map, kind of like the head-scab model, but also maybe a GPS-based app on your phone that you could go stand at your cornfield when you see those first tassels, look at the app and say, okay, does it make sense? Do we have that risk for Fusarium granularum infection? Should we consider a fungicide as a management strategy? Because that's really that decision at that point is the fungicide trigger. And the fungicide trigger may be different for Fusarium granularum than what it's going to be for tar spot and other diseases.
You mentioned fungicide, and that's one question that I get often is, I think maybe fungicide causes vomitoxin. Could you maybe give us a little bit of clarity on that topic?
Yeah, that question of does fungicide cause vomitoxin, I think we're painting fungicide with too broad a brush. That would be like saying that all herbicides are the same, and if we just said a herbicide does something, that's too broad a brush. We really have to get down to active ingredients when it comes to painting a brush of what a fungicide does or doesn't do. Do we have solid data that says in corn a fungicide causes higher DON levels? There's no solid data on that. There is data that shows in wheat that the strobies do actually increase scab. So it makes sense that the strobies could, but then the application timing is going to matter also. Probably once that gets to that brown silk timing on corn, you're not going to see any fungicide effect. What a fungicide may do would be increase your pollination window, which is kind of like a coin toss. Is that good or bad? So an increased pollination window increases our chances of full pollination and full grain fill. But an increased pollination window increases our risk for infection. So when I talk about that increased risk of infection, so the only time that Fusarium granularum fungus actually infects the ear portion of the plant is while there's wet silks. Once those silks turn brown and dry, that fungus doesn't move down and into the ear. Now there's another infection window, which is actually kind of an emergence where we get some stalk infection that causes stalk rot. That actually produces vomitoxin also, which is an issue in silage. Not a problem in corn grains, so we don't discuss it quite as much. But that's another window, but kind of confusing here. There's no correlation between the two. I can have high stalk rot, high vom in my stalk, and absolutely nothing in the ear. Or high levels in the ear and absolutely nothing in the stalk. So those two don't really correlate, and it's all based on infection window, and it doesn't move a lot throughout the plant. Now, in the fungicide portion, if we want control, we get this small window, because the only time that the fungicides that have active ingredients on vomitoxin are going to move into that ear is during the wet silk pollination timing. So we have to apply while we still have wet silks, and we only have really two products that currently carry a label for DON management and control, and those products really, if you're going to utilize them, are best applied during that wet silk timing, and we have to get it down to the silks. And we still have some of those questions. So we have a project sponsored by Ohio Corn Board that's looking at application method of those two products and seeing when we apply them, how well are we getting them down to the silks? Does application rate matter? So we're utilizing a drone with 3 different configurations, and then a boom application with both drops and just a boom over the top running 15 or 20 gallons per acre for those application rates. A lot of the research has been done on fungicides for VOM utilizing drops. And that makes sense because we get it down to the ear. My challenge with drops is on some of these sprayers today, they don't recommend we even run the 24-inch drops. And they definitely don't recommend we run a full boom, so 120 feet of some of the heavier drops that really go down into the canopy. And we did a project a few years back, actually a nitrogen project, and if our sprayer driver didn't do a good job, we were losing about 8 bushels to the acre due to our poor sprayer driver. So we really want to be able to use the full boom. So going over the top, if that works, is exciting. And then you get to drone or aerial, that's even more exciting. We have some concerns there, but we want to know, do we get enough product down onto the silks with those types of application methods? And that's part of a 3-year project we're working on with Ohio Corn Board.
Well, I think we'll all be excited to see what the results of that project will be. So speaking of the Corn Board, Anecdotally, farmers, elevators, and seed companies have understood that a difference existed between hybrids and their vomitoxin tolerance. So thanks to you and the Ohio Corn Board for funding a study to really evaluate those differences. Can you describe just how a project such as this is conducted? Like, how do we have a vomitoxin study? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is a really labor-intensive study, so it's really a huge shout out to Ohio Corn Board for recognizing this challenge and funding this project. Because when we look at how this study is conducted, so we put a call out open to all seed companies to put in hybrids of their choosing into the project. And we had the first year, so in 2023 was our first year, we had 8 seed companies submit hybrids. We had right at 80 hybrids total, and a wide range of how they chose those hybrids and what they submitted. Some submitted a large portfolio, and some of them submitted a smaller portfolio, and they kind of had some anecdotal knowledge of where they thought those hybrids would end up, because it was somewhat a test to us. The project the first year was, are we doing good work, and are our results going to be accurate? Because it's risky business doing this vomitoxin research, because we have grad students that have to go out and walk these fields and do inoculation, so we're sure we have fungus during that wet silk timing. So we think about a spread like 99, I think we're 99 to 114 day maturity group spread. Those grad students didn't just walk the field once. We planted them with a research plot planner, so we put all those seeds in a little packet, go through and we plant 35-foot long plots, and then those grad students walked, and we had 2 rows. 1 row got inoculated and 1 row didn't. And they walk with a backpack sprayer and a solution, and they spray it on those silks, and that puts the inoculum out there. And then we count on Mother Nature to provide us with the right weather conditions. But most of those plots, they had to walk at least twice, or some of them 3 times, in order to get the inoculum on at the right timing, because we didn't want to favor any maturity group. Everything was randomized out in the field. Against, maturity groups were randomized. Within group, we did sort of help the grad students out, so we subplot blocked maturity groups, so that they didn't have to look through the entire plot to find a maturity group, but then we randomized within maturity groups, so that everything was randomly spread for those weather patterns. We looked for uniform fields, of course, to put that in, and then they went through and they inoculated. Now we have 3 sites. One of them is down South Charleston at the Western Research Station. In Bucyrus, we were on farm, and then over at Wooster, we were at the Apple Creek Research Farm. And in 23, only 2 sites got inoculated. The western site had a windstorm come through just right at the first push of tassels, and the poor grad students would have had to walk through lodged corn, and we kind of figured we preferred them to stay upright and not be tripping over corn with their backpack sprayers and tough suits on while they were out there inoculating. So they inoculated, and then we came through at harvest. Each site was harvested slightly different. Each site had different weather conditions. Harvested with a small plot combine that utilizes a cyclone sampler. So the cyclone sampler somewhat takes and spins that grain sample and puts it into a cyclone cone to create a uniform pull of sample across that plot. So we pulled an inoculated and a non-inoculated look at 2 sites, and the other site was just the non-inoculated because the grad students weren't able to go up and walk through those plots. Analyze that data, looking for, the eventual goal of the project would be to be able to start to classify things as susceptible and resistant. Or probably we'll never have anything we call truly resistant, but moderate resistance, because everything seems to have a little bit of susceptibility to it. But as we looked at those different hybrids, for this first year's data, kind of what we say is, if we saw high numbers, we know it's susceptible. Low numbers, we'd like to see more years of data to truly say that they have that moderate resistance. Something could have happened that maybe caused them just to not develop that year. We don't know. That's where that importance of multiple sites, multiple years comes from. And as we look here into 24, different companies are putting in different numbers. We got some companies that put in less, some companies that put in more, as they look at how to work with this program. And I think most companies, the results we got back were kind of when they were testing us what they expected to see. But what we found, across all companies, there's some susceptibles and some resistant lines, and it's an important thing to have that discussion based on your need with your seedsmen, because there's becoming that knowledge out there that they can help you figure out what best fits for your farm and your needs, because some people have that tolerance, some don't, to take that risk, and that all just depends what your own farm's looking for.
That was just a fantastic summary. You mentioned that 8 companies participated last year. Just to be clear, everyone was invited and there was no preferential treatment given, correct?
Yeah, so we invited everybody, and we did grow the project this year. Got a few more companies in. I think we're up to a little over 90 hybrids. So thanks to Corn Board for the first 2 years. There was no cost to the project to the companies. As it grows, if companies start putting in more hybrids or things change, there may be entry fees and things in the future. But the first couple of years, really, those Ohio corn marketing dollars, our farmers' checkoff dollars, are what's funding that. And I think each company had a little bit different risk level, and there's a lot of risk. We could have, if we go back in history, I guess, to give a little bit of history, we've done this work. Backpack inoculation is very different than the original inoculation we did. So the original inoculation we did, we actually used a syringe like we were giving a cow a shot, and we took that syringe and you put it into the tip of the ear. And when you do that, you actually mitigate some of the natural defenses of the plant, because you're no longer looking at how it travels down the silk channel. And with silk inoculation, we can push vomitoxin DON levels over 200 parts per million. With some of that work, the low numbers were 50 parts per million. So, that 50 parts per million doesn't look good. But now there's differences in hybrids. We had 50 to 200 with the same inoculation method. So we do have another project, really, that's also funded by Ohio Corn Board to look at how do we better inoculate. And what does that mean, and how are we breaking down the plant's natural defense mechanisms with the different styles of inoculation? And that project is also looking for a mass throughput method. Can we go out and spray inoculum around with a high clearance sprayer with drops, just try to get it down on that ear, and move that inoculum into the canopy and eliminate those grad students having to walk through? Because really, when we think about it for Ohio producers, wouldn't it be great if we could screen that hybrid maybe before you make the final pull? When a seed company is looking at trying to pick out the next group of hybrids for Ohio, can we at least have 1 year of data that kind of lets Ohio producers know when it's first rolled out that susceptibility versus resistance? And we're also not working directly with breeders. I know seed companies are going back and talking to breeders, and we've had some feedback from some breeders where they've taken and looked at different companies' hybrids, and even if it's not their company, breeders kind of seem to have some knowledge of what some of those parents were of other companies' hybrids, and they're putting things together like, okay, this female or this male seems to be, when it goes on with another one, we're getting higher DON levels. So I think we're actually, just out of 1 year's data, as we continue to grow this project, it's going to have effect all the way up the seed supply. But we are in a microclimate of, Ohio, southern Michigan, Ontario, Canada. We're not the biggest corn producing region, so we're not going to be the focus. And we also haven't been the focus of federal dollars for mycotoxin management, which is something I guess we have to think about too, and watch what mycotoxin really means.
No, I think it's great, and this research is super impactful for all of Ohio's farmers. Personally, I love the consistency of the data that we saw last year. I am very excited to see what year 2 has to bring. Is there anything that you learned during year 1 that you're implementing into year 2? Any changes that were made to the study?
The base of the study stayed the same. So as we've added grad students, so year 1 we didn't actually have any grad students on the project. It was all extension, and we had a couple lab personnel that we put on the project that were trying to pull this project off. So with grad students, we're going to be able to collect more data. So people ask, what did ear position mean? Well, we didn't collect that data yet, but that data is part of the project. Is now we have a grad student that can walk the plots and kind of help with that data collection, because we all run out of time, unfortunately. But the base protocol didn't change a whole lot for the hybrids and how we're inoculating, because we were very happy with the inoculation method this year. And how we were able to determine that is, with 3 sites, it gave us the look, and by having a natural and an inoculated, we're able to look at if we were breaking down the natural defenses of that plant with our inoculation method. And when we inoculated, we had slightly higher DON levels, but we didn't change the order of inoculation. So if we go to stats, we ran statistics on it, and it wasn't significant in statistics to inoculate or not inoculate. If the inoculation was significant, that would have been concerning, because that would have meant that our inoculation was actually changing the hybrid response, and that's not what we want. We want the hybrid to respond like it would in nature. But what we saw mostly across those inoculate plots was we did push numbers higher, but we didn't really change the basic order of it. If it was a majoritatively low or a bottom 20, it would stay in the bottom 20. If it was a top 20, it'd stay in the top 20. The middle hybrids maybe bounced around a little bit more, but we had fairly solid results that way, so we didn't change those protocols a lot. And I guess the thing we really did, though, is we've added more things to what Ohio Corn Board is funding. So we have that fungicide application method study. And then we added an intensive study with 20 different hybrids, 10 that came out of the highest non-hybrids kind of in our study, and 10 that came out of the lowest. And there's a grad student that's really intensively taking notes on those hybrids to try to learn more what's going on. She gets to go out and walk those daily to see, were those higher non-hybrids? Did they just have a naturally longer silking window, a shorter silking window? Did they have longer silk, shorter silks? So she's taking a lot of notes, and I think that'll be very interesting to see what we see as those traits, maybe phenotypically, visually, between some of those hybrids.
You alluded to it before, but with all the attention that this project has received, and with the focus on taking more notes and gathering more information, one would assume that this would be that participation would have been greater this upcoming year. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what participation looks like this year?
Yeah, so we did grow participation. Some companies put in more hybrids than last year, added companies to the project. One of the challenges is, and this will be a challenge that's going away, just with our funding cycles and things, we didn't put the call out for hybrids until April. In April, people aren't thinking about how to find plot seed. So we had a silage study this year, and that study we had to charge for because we don't have those same size of checkoff dollars. The silage study had a small grant from Ohio dairy producers, but it's nothing like what Ohio Corn Board could provide. And as probably you could explain really well, a lot of budgets are already set and seeds already allocated. So that tight turnaround, we only give companies about 3 weeks to get seed in historically, has actually been one of the great limitations to some companies to participation, finding hybrids or figuring out, who all we need to talk to, whose permission we need in different things to put seed in. So this year, we're not on solid funding because everything is year to year, but we're comfortable with where we're at with Corn Board. We're comfortable with results to hopefully put that call out here this fall after harvest, which will really help a lot of seed companies be able to have that discussion as to what hybrids we should put in, and when we have to start charging, actually be able to put us in the budget. Because we've heard that multiple times is we just didn't have you in the budget. So as we move forward, that's kind of, guess I would say one of the goals in order to grow the hybrid entries is to have that calling out earlier, and just work closer and figure out what we need to make this work better for Ohio farmers. Unfortunately, I wish I could say so in November I'll have the 24 report out, because that would be awesome. That part is slow. And so what happens is after we harvest, we take it back to the lab, we grind all of that, and then we submit samples, and not to a test like the elevator runs. So the elevator runs a rapid test. You may not feel like it's rapid when you sit there for 5 to 7 minutes, but in the grand scheme of lab work, that is a rapid test. Everything we run is ran through a mass spec, liquid gas chromatography. It takes a lot of time. We actually work with a partner university and don't run those in-house, which actually lowers our costs than what our in-house costs would be. So we work with a wheat lab, and they run our samples. It works out nice because they run our samples when they don't have wheat samples to run over winter. We got results out in March. We're hoping to have results out a little bit earlier this year. With the earlier corn harvest, that should help. They're ready for our samples usually about the 1st of December. So they can start running those, hopefully start getting site data out, and we'll just have to see this year. We inoculated everything, so every site's got inoculated and natural infection. It's just going to be after pollination. How did that fungus multiply within the ear to drive those dawn numbers? I think our Worcester site's probably where we're going to get our highest numbers from this year. They've caught a lot of rains, and when I say the Worcester site, we're out kind of closer to Apple Creek on what they call the Apple Creek Research Farm. And that farm somehow, it must just be living right. It's caught some rain showers that the campus and some of the other farms right there around that Worcester campus haven't caught, and it's definitely, we've seen where it's driven other fungal diseases, so we'll have to see how it drives dawn this year.
Well, I can only speak for me, but given how important this information is to Ohio's farmers, you do the study, I'll get you the money, and I'll get you the seed. Moving forward, we've talked at length about hybrid selection and stuff. Are there any other management tactics that growers should be looking at to help reduce vomitoxin in their corn?
Yeah, so we talked about hybrid selection. I think we're learning a lot there. We're learning a lot on the fungicide portion. We know the right fungicide makes the difference. Have to always quantify that, because I just talked about how broad brush fungicide isn't really accurate. The right fungicide makes a difference. Other things when we think about vomitoxin and management, a lot of the same tools we use for other risk mitigation. So pollination windows, when that happens. So if we plant different maturity groups and we have some different planting dates, that helps spread out and with some of that risk mitigation of what are those conditions actually going to be like during pollination. There's some questions about nitrogen management. We don't really have an answer. Is there a higher or a lower nitrogen rate? But we also know some things that increase yield may increase vomitoxin, because a longer pollination window, a more humid canopy, the more leaves we have within a canopy, typically, the more humid that canopy is going to be, are all those environmental conditions. So a lot of the things we talk about management-wise may just change the microenvironment of a field. And that is what changes maybe the management. So our causation isn't directly correlated to nitrogen. It's correlated to the other changes within that plant because of our nitrogen application and things. Those are all things to work on. Other things we're working on, though, that we have found results with is some of the harvest management strategies and after-harvest management. So Gibberella ear rot, we call it an ear rot. It's really a cob rot that grows also within the grain. So when we think about harvest management, anything we do to set that combine better actually can lower our dawn levels. If we're harvesting and we're breaking a lot of cob, that's going to increase cob dust and cob that gets into that sample. Mm-hmm. When you go to the elevator, if they suck up a piece of rotten cob, I can guarantee you're going to have high dawn levels. And they don't need to pick that cob out when they run your sample, because you sold them that cob, and that cob is high in dawn. And that's one of the things you see that creates some variability in corn. When we get more cob and more dust in there, when we talk about those combine settings, so round bars actually changing concaves around, which makes it a little bit more gentle. Going to be a pain this year if we do happen to have some issues, because you're going to be bouncing, I think, a lot of growers between corn and beans back and forth. So we may be doing more combine adjustments. Looking at airspeed, dawn, the dust, and the fines, so the grain becomes more brittle. We tend to break more corn when we have high dawn levels. But if we get rid of that broken grain, we blow that dust out of the combine, then we're going to have lower levels in the grain setup. We're going to have lower levels at the elevator. Work with some growers that put screens underneath the clean grain augers, put screens on the combines. Talk to a few guys that just shut off their reclean, because basically they realized the stuff in the reclean on the combine was their highest dawn level. So they just dumped all the reclean out in the field, and they lost a bushel or two, but they were also dropping those dawn levels a couple points, and it was significant. We've done some work with some really simple grain cleaners. I will say the thing on a grain cleaner is the more time it spends in the grain cleaner and the better job you do, which makes sense, the lower the dawn level, the better advantage you will get. Rotary drum cleaner, some work we did this spring up at Worcester, just an old machine. I'm going to guess it's out of the late 80s, early 90s up there, that they had over at the organic farm for doing some cleaning to get weed seed out. We were dropping 1 or 2 parts per million. but we found that if we slowed the grain flow through it, we did a better job. So it could run 1,500 bushel an hour at full flow. If we slowed that down, we did a little bit better job. But we wanted to do some more work just with that simple one. We're in discussions on a more complex grain cleaner. If we have high DON levels, possibly have a company interested in making a donation of a machine for us to try 1 year that's got more airspeed to it, use a little bit different grain cleaning technology, just to see how that really changes and affects those DON levels, because we've seen good results with some other mycotoxins, just the work hasn't been done on DON and grain cleaning as much.
You mentioned other mycotoxins. Is there any research or future research that Ohio State is considering conducting for those other mycotoxins that are out there?
Yeah, so at Ohio State, we would like to be the DON or the vomitoxin center for the country. You know, if we could convince in farm bill discussions in the future some federal funding, we would love to have an institute or something for vomitoxin, really focus in on that mycotoxin, because that's our biggest problem. Mm-hmm. There are other mycotoxins, and there's actually other vomitoxins that fall in the vomitoxin category than just DON. And there's other ones that are produced by Fusarium granularum. The biggest one we talk about in that realm is zearalenone, and we'd like to do some research there, especially for our dairy and swine producers, because zearalenone is estrogen mimicking, so it causes some issues in our female herds. So our sow herds and our dairy herds have had some issues with zearalenone. Other mycotoxins out there, there's like 500 plus. I mean, we could talk all day about other mycotoxins. One that's really hits the radar a lot across the country is alpha-toxin. Alpha-toxin, it is a hot and dry disease. And it actually, so there is federal funding for mycotoxin research, but it is specifically line itemized for alpha-toxin. Mm-hmm. Because alpha-toxin, I really don't want to have to deal with alpha-toxin. Alpha-toxin, we're talking 1 part per billion, is the number we're talking about. Where DON, I'm talking, I want under 1 part per million for dairy and swine rations. So yeah, I say 1, but that million versus billion, that is huge. I know a few guys down in the Carolinas I talk to, and they normally don't have issues with alpha-toxin, but they've had a more severe drought than even our southern part of Ohio, and they have alpha-toxin issues, and most of their feed goes into either swine or chickens, and they're trying to figure out what to do with their corn. I mean, there's guys out there that they can't export it. There's not really a rail market to send it to. The rail doesn't run that way, so they don't know what they're going to do. They're considering spreading that corn just back on the field because they have high alpha-toxin numbers. So trying to figure out, so that's a big problem, and there's a lot of attention to that mycotoxin just because of its low tolerance. But you know, at Ohio State, for now, DON is our big issue. And then we'll move into zearalenone and maybe some of the other ones that come along with the gibberella urate. Mm-hmm. Definitely, you know, we keep our ears and eyes open, though, to all of them. The fumosins, we sometimes have some of the fumosins at low levels, usually not at such a level that we're getting rejections or even testing for it. But there's a lot of mycotoxins out there that could create issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have been just a wealth of knowledge today, so thank you for coming. Is there any events coming up that you'll be speaking at that you'd like to plug, or any other research that you'd like to talk about while we wrap up here today?
Yeah, so definitely appreciate the opportunity to discuss DON management with Ohio growers. And actually, if you're here tomorrow and you have questions, I'll be down at Ask the Expert. Don't ask me what time, but I know I got tapped for Ask the Expert tomorrow afternoon for some DON management discussion down there. And then throughout the fall, we have a couple of different programs. We really think about, you know, our Ohio State Agronomy days this winter. We'll definitely be discussing this issue and continuing to build and have that ability to discuss more current research. And we really appreciate all the seed companies that are supporting us. With that hybrid study, they made seed donations. With the study with those 20 different hybrids characterizing them, all the seed we're using for this project's really been donated, and Ohio Corn Board has funded the dollars that are going with it for now. So really, every Ohio corn farmer out there, we have a big thank you to them. And I think the exciting part about this is, you know, we talked about doing this work at Ohio State, but the grad students we're bringing on board. We have 4 grad students on this project. We're now going to eventually have 4 people, whether it's in industry or at universities in the future, that have a very strong knowledge and understanding of DON and mycotoxins and how they interact in the plant and what that all means to move them forward. And they might be in a position where they're not really working on it, but it seems like your grad work just kind of comes up in the back of your mind every now and then, even when you walk away and you're not doing that type of research anymore.
Thanks again. And we mentioned this study. Year 1 results are out. Where could they find those results?
Yeah, so the results, we published them in the Corn newsletter. We're also going to have links to them through eFields. Really, the easiest way to find them is go.osu.edu /Don 2023 is where you can find all those results from all the different seed companies. Maybe use that and just have those discussions with your seedsman about, what do I need for my farm? What's my goals? Because your goal is what matters for your operation to match what you need and what your risk ability is. I think growers that are feeding maybe have the lowest risk, and then if you're selling into a set market, I guess we didn't really discuss our ethanol industry, which has been big. The ethanol industry, they talk about a feed product, and we used to call it a byproduct. Now we call it a co-product because that is a co-profit stream for them. They have to be able to feed that. And one thing we don't realize, I have a slide in my slide deck that I really need data to update because we talk about the ethanol process triples the Don number. The truth is they've gotten more efficient. They take more out of the corn grain and leave less in the byproduct, which actually, interesting, makes it mostly a better feed product because they take more of the fat out, which used to cause us some real heartaches in the ruminant industry to feed their byproducts. But as they've done that, it's somewhere between 3 and 4 times what it does to that grain. So just knowing where you're marketing to and having those discussions, it'll be good. I encourage people to go look at that. We'll get our results out as quick as we can from all of our different studies. And definitely, you ask about other projects. We try to publish as much of our research as possible in the eFields program or in the eBarns program, depending if it's focused more towards livestock or more towards agronomy. And with those programs, it's 1 year's data. We try to take away that fact that the university used to do research for 3 or 4 years, publish it in a journal, which took 2 years, and 5 years later, we got it in farmers' hands. So now we put it in farmers' hands, but we also remind them. It's 1 year's data, and things can change. Environment changes, things change. So take that 1 year's data, use it for your operation, and build on it. Look at the research again next year. Continue to build and understand and put those years of data together, just like you really do on your own farm. Most of the time, you don't just change your complete operation after 1 year. You try something, and you just grow what you're trying as you see it work or not work. Do the same thing with that 1 year's research data. But definitely utilize that data to try new things on your farm.
Well, thanks again to Jason Hartschuh. Appreciate your time today. As we wrap up here at the start of day 2 of our Golden Harvest interview series here at Farm Science Review, I'm Wade Looker, your Golden Harvest agronomist, and we'll catch you again this afternoon.